The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Margaret's kitchen window as she carefully arranged fresh daisies in her grandmother's crystal vase. At 72, she had learned to find joy in small rituals. But today felt different somehow. Today marked exactly 5 years since Harold had passed away, and instead of the familiar weight of grief, she felt something unexpected stirring in her chest, a whisper of possibility. Margaret had been Harold's devoted wife for 47 years, and in all that time, she had never questioned whether their love was truly mutual. Harold was a practical man, a successful accountant who provided well for their family. He was dependable, responsible, and never raised his voice. What more could a woman want? She had convinced herself that his quiet, reserved nature was simply his way of showing love. But lately, as she sorted through his belongings in preparation for finally donating them to charity, she had begun to see their marriage through different eyes. The discovery of his personal journal had been accidental. She was looking for his insurance papers when the leather-bound book fell from behind his desk drawer. What she read there changed everything she thought she knew about their life together. Harold had written extensively about feeling trapped, about settling for someone who would make a suitable wife but never set his heart on fire. He wrote about Ruth, a woman from his office whom he had loved in secret for decades, and how he had chosen duty over passion when he married Margaret. The words cut through her heart like shards of glass. Margaret is a good woman, but I've never felt for her what I believe love should be. I've grown comfortable with comfortable, and perhaps that's enough for a man like me. Now, 5 years after his funeral, where she had grieved as his loving widow, Margaret sat in her quiet kitchen wondering if she had ever truly been loved at all. The realization should have destroyed her, but instead it awakened something she thought had died long ago. The young woman who had once dreamed of grand romance and deep connection. Her reverie was interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. Through the peephole, she saw her neighbor Clara, holding a plate covered with her signature blue checkered cloth. "Good morning, Margaret," Clara said with her warm smile as Margaret opened the door. "I made too many blueberry muffins again, and Tom says if I don't stop baking so much, he'll need new pants." She laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Would you like some company with your coffee this morning?" Clara Henderson was everything Margaret had never been, vivacious, outspoken, and unapologetically herself. At 68, she had silver hair that she wore in a fashionable bob, and she dressed in bright colors that Harold would have called too flashy for a woman your age. She had moved in next door 3 years ago after her divorce was finalized, and Margaret had been both fascinated and slightly scandalized by her neighbor's story. Clara had left her husband of 35 years after discovering he had been having affairs throughout their marriage. Instead of quietly enduring it, as Margaret might have done, Clara had filed for divorce, sold their house, and moved across the country to be near her daughter. She spoke openly about feeling liberated, about discovering who she was when she wasn't trying to be the perfect wife to an unfaithful husband. "I'd love the company," Margaret said, stepping aside to let Clara in. The two women had developed an easy friendship over the past 3 years, though Margaret had never shared the deeper truths about her marriage. As they settled at Margaret's kitchen table with steaming mugs of coffee and Clara's impossibly tender muffins, Clara studied her friend's face with concerned eyes. "You look different today, honey. Not sad exactly, but thoughtful. Is everything all right?" Margaret found herself hesitating on the edge of confession. Harold had been gone for 5 years, but she had maintained the fiction of their happy marriage even in death. What would people think if they knew the truth? What would they think of her? "Clara," she began slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "can I ask you something? How did you know? About your husband, I mean. How did you know that what you had wasn't enough?" Clara set down her coffee cup with a gentle clink and leaned forward. "Oh, Margaret, what's brought this on?" And suddenly the dam burst. Margaret found herself telling Clara everything, about Harold's journal, about the 47 years of what she now realized had been emotional loneliness disguised as contentment, about the woman named Ruth, whom Harold had truly loved but never pursued. She spoke of how she had tried so hard to be the perfect wife, how she had suppressed her own dreams and desires to fit into the shape Harold needed her to be. "I thought I was happy, Clara. I thought what we had was enough. But reading his words, I realized I spent nearly half a century begging for crumbs of affection from a man who saw me as convenient rather than cherished. Clara reached across the table and took Margaret's hands in her own. Her touch was warm and grounding. Honey, I'm so sorry you've had to carry this alone. But can I tell you something? The fact that you're sitting here recognizing the truth of your situation means you're stronger than you know. It takes courage to admit that our lives haven't been what we pretended they were. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they weren't entirely tears of sadness. Mixed in was something that felt almost like relief. But Clara, I'm 72 years old. It's too late for me to start over, isn't it? I've wasted my whole life. Clara squeezed her hands tighter. Margaret Rose Patterson, don't you dare say you've wasted your life. You raised 3 beautiful children who adore you. You volunteered at the hospital for 20 years. You've been a source of kindness and strength to everyone around you. Just because your marriage wasn't what you deserved doesn't mean your life has been worthless. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. But it's also not too late for new chapters. Do you think love has an expiration date? Do you think joy stops being available to us just because we've reached a certain age? Margaret had never considered this possibility. In her generation, women her age were expected to be grateful for their memories, to tend their gardens and spoil their grandchildren and fade gracefully into the background. The idea that she might still be entitled to happiness, to romance, to feeling truly seen and valued by another person, seemed almost revolutionary. I wouldn't even know where to begin, Margaret admitted. Clara's eyes sparkled with mischief. Well, as it happens, I might have an idea about that. Have you ever been to the community center's senior social club? Margaret shook her head. She had seen the flyers at the grocery store but had never given them serious thought. They meet every Thursday evening. It's not a dating service exactly, but it's a place where people our age get together to play cards, share potluck dinners, sometimes go on group outings. There are widows and widowers, divorced folks, even some people who never married. The point is to have companionship and fun. The idea terrified and thrilled Margaret in equal measure. I don't know, Clara. I haven't socialized much since Harold died. I'm not sure I'd know how to talk to people, especially men. That's exactly why you should come. You don't have to be looking for romance, Margaret, but you deserve to remember what it feels like to laugh with other people, to feel interesting and interested in the world around you. Will you think about it? Margaret nodded slowly. I'll think about it. Over the next few days, Margaret found herself considering Clara's suggestion more seriously. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman who had let herself fade. Her hair, once a rich auburn, had gone completely gray and was pulled back in the same simple bun she'd worn for decades. Her clothes were serviceable but uninspiring, the wardrobe of someone who had given up trying to be noticed. On Wednesday afternoon, she did something she hadn't done in years. She made an appointment at Bella's beauty salon downtown. I want to look like myself again, she told Bella, the young stylist who had taken over the shop from her mother, but I'm not sure who that is anymore. Bella, who was probably young enough to be Margaret's granddaughter but had an old soul and gentle hands, studied Margaret's face in the mirror. I think you're someone who's been hiding her light under a bushel for too long. Let's see if we can bring some of that light back. 3 hours later, Margaret stared at herself in amazement. Her hair, now a beautiful silver with subtle highlights, was cut in a modern style that framed her face and brought out her eyes. Bella had also taught her how to apply makeup that enhanced her natural features without making her look like she was trying too hard. You look radiant, Bella said with genuine warmth. Whoever you're becoming, she's going to be wonderful. On Thursday evening, Margaret stood in front of her closet wearing her new hairstyle and feeling more like herself than she had in decades. She chose a dress she had bought years ago, but never worn. Harold had said the deep blue color was too bold for her. Now she realized it brought out her eyes and made her feel confident. Clara had offered to pick her up, and when Margaret opened the door, her friend's face lit up with delight. Margaret, you look absolutely stunning. I barely recognize you, but at the same time, you look more like yourself than I've ever seen you. The community center was buzzing with activity when they arrived. Margaret felt her nerves threatening to overwhelm her, but Clara's steady presence beside her gave her courage. The senior social club had transformed the main hall into a warm, inviting space with round tables covered in cheerful tablecloths, soft lighting, and the gentle hum of conversation and laughter. "Clara, you made it," called a woman with short, curly gray hair and a warm smile. "And you must be Margaret. Clara's told us so much about you." This was Dorothy, the club's organizer, and she immediately made Margaret feel welcome. She introduced her to several other members, and Margaret was surprised to find herself genuinely enjoying the conversations. These weren't the polite, surface-level exchanges she had grown accustomed to over the years. These people were talking about books they'd read, places they'd traveled, dreams they still hoped to pursue. She was chatting with a retired teacher named Susan about their shared love of gardening when she became aware of someone approaching their table. She looked up to see a tall, distinguished man with kind eyes and silver hair. "Excuse me, ladies. I don't mean to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about roses. I'm Frank Morrison, and I've been battling black spot on my peace roses all summer. I don't suppose either of you has any wisdom to share." Susan laughed and gestured to Margaret. "You'll want to talk to Margaret. She has the most beautiful rose garden in the neighborhood." As Susan excused herself to refresh her coffee, Frank asked if he could join Margaret at the table. There was something different about the way he looked at her, not polite and distant, as Harold always had, but genuinely interested in what she had to say. "I have to admit," Frank said with a sheepish smile, "the roses were just an excuse to come talk to you. I noticed you when you walked in, and I was hoping to find a way to introduce myself that didn't make me sound like an old fool." Margaret felt herself blushing, but it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from the unfamiliar pleasure of being noticed, of being sought out by someone who seemed genuinely drawn to her. They talked for the rest of the evening about gardening, yes, but also about books and travel and their children and grandchildren. Frank was a retired engineer who had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. He spoke of her with love and respect, but also with the acceptance of someone who was ready to honor his past while remaining open to his future. "I hope you don't think I'm being too forward," Frank said as the evening was winding down. "But would you be interested in having dinner with me this Saturday? There's a little Italian place downtown that I've been wanting to try, but eating alone has lost its appeal." Margaret felt her heart racing in a way it hadn't in decades. This was what Clara had meant about new chapters. This was what it felt like to be chosen, not settled for. "I would love that, Frank." Their first date was everything Margaret had dreamed of, but never experienced. Frank picked her up with flowers. Not obligatory roses, but a cheerful bouquet of mixed wildflowers that reminded her of the fields behind her childhood home. He opened doors for her, not out of habit or duty, but because he seemed to genuinely want to take care of her. Over dinner, they discovered they had both always wanted to visit Ireland, had both read and loved the same novels, and both believed that laughter was the most important ingredient in any relationship. Frank told her stories that made her laugh until her sides hurt, and he listened to her opinions with genuine interest and respect. "Margaret," he said as they shared tiramisu for dessert, "I hope you won't think this is just an old man's fancy, but I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to meet someone like you." The words should have sounded too good to be true, but something in Frank's eyes told Margaret he meant every word. This was what it felt like to be treasured rather than tolerated. Their courtship, for that's what it was, old-fashioned and sweet and romantic, unfolded over the following months like a flower opening to the sun. Frank courted Margaret with a tenderness and enthusiasm that Harold had never shown her, even in their earliest days. He brought her books he thought she'd enjoy, planned picnics in the park, and held her hand during evening walks as if she were precious to him. Margaret found herself blooming under Frank's attention. She laughed more than she had in years, tried new things, and rediscovered parts of herself that had been dormant for decades. She started painting again, something she had given up when Harold declared it an expensive hobby. She joined the book club at the library and found she had strong opinions about literature that people actually wanted to hear. But perhaps most importantly, she learned what it felt like to be in a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Frank sought her opinion on everything from what movie to see to how to handle a disagreement with his grown son. He never made her feel foolish or dismissed her thoughts as unimportant. One evening in October, as they sat on Margaret's porch swing, watching the leaves fall, Frank took her hand and looked at her with serious eyes. Margaret, I know we're not young anymore, and I know people might think we're being foolish, but I love you. I love your laugh and your gentle heart and the way you see beauty in everything around you. I love how you make me feel like the man I always hoped I could be. He paused, seeming to gather his courage. I don't want to spend whatever years I have left wondering what if. Would you consider marrying me? Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy and amazement. At 73, she was hearing words of love that she had waited her entire life to hear. Oh, Frank, yes, of course, yes. Their wedding was small and perfect, held in Clara's garden with their children and closest friends in attendance. Margaret wore a dress the color of champagne and felt more beautiful than she ever had as a young bride. When Frank looked at her as she walked toward him, his face shone with such obvious love and joy that everyone present could feel the sincerity of his devotion. During their vows which they had written themselves, Frank spoke words that made Margaret's heart soar. Margaret, you have taught me that it's never too late for new beginnings, never too late to find the love we're meant to have. You make every day an adventure, and I promise to cherish you for all the days of my life. When it was Margaret's turn, she spoke from a place of hard-won wisdom. Frank, for most of my life, I accepted less than I deserved because I didn't believe I was worthy of more. You have shown me that real love doesn't ask us to diminish ourselves to fit into someone else's idea of who we should be. Instead, it celebrates who we are and encourages us to become even more. I promise to love you with the full heart of the woman I was always meant to be. As they danced to their first song as husband and wife, The Way You Look Tonight, played by a string quartet that included Frank's musician granddaughter, Margaret marveled at the path that had brought her to this moment. Harold's death had been the end of one chapter, but the discovery of his journal had been the beginning of her real story. She thought of all the women who, like her younger self, might be settling for relationships that left them feeling empty and invisible. She thought of the years she had wasted trying to earn love from someone who was incapable of giving it, and she felt profound gratitude for having learned, even late in life, what it meant to be truly cherished. Later that evening, as she and Frank sat in their hotel room overlooking the ocean, they had decided on a weekend honeymoon at a charming bed and breakfast on the coast. Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place of unexpected happiness. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had met when we were younger? Frank asked, his arm around her, as they watched the moonlight dance on the water. Margaret considered the question seriously. I think we needed to become who we are now to be ready for this kind of love. I spent so many years not knowing my own worth. If you had met me then, I might not have recognized what you were offering, or I might not have believed I deserved it. Frank nodded thoughtfully. Sarah used to say that everything happens in its own time. Maybe our time is now. And as Margaret settled into her new husband's embrace, she knew he was right. This was their time. Not too late. Not a consolation prize for youth gone by, but exactly when it was meant to be. She had learned that love had no expiration date, that it was never too late to choose happiness over habit, passion over settling. In the months that followed, Margaret and Frank built a life together that was everything her marriage to Harold had never been. They traveled to Ireland, just as they had both dreamed of doing. They took cooking classes together and laughed at their disasters. They read the same books so they could discuss them over breakfast, and they held hands in movie theaters like teenagers. Most importantly, they supported each other's individual growth. Frank encouraged Margaret's painting and helped her set up a studio in the sunroom of their new home. Margaret supported Frank's decision to volunteer with a literacy program, reading to children at the local elementary school. Their relationship became a model for their friends and families of what love could look like in later life. Margaret's daughter Jennifer, who had worried that her mother was making a mistake by remarrying, confessed that seeing her mother so genuinely happy had changed her own perspective on her marriage. Mom, I never saw you laugh the way you laugh with Frank, Jennifer said during one of their weekly phone calls. It made me realize that I've been settling for good enough in my own relationship. David and I have started going to counseling, and we're trying to build the kind of partnership you and Frank have. Margaret felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her journey toward authentic love had encouraged her daughter to seek the same in her own life. Perhaps this was one of the greatest gifts of finding happiness later in life, the opportunity to model for younger generations that it was never too late to choose love over convenience, joy over mere contentment. 2 years into their marriage, Frank surprised Margaret with a gift that made her cry with happiness. He had been working secretly with a local gallery owner to arrange Margaret's first art show. Her paintings, vibrant, joyful canvases, full of flowers and landscapes and portraits of the grandchildren she adored, filled the small gallery's walls. At the opening reception, surrounded by friends and family and strangers who had come to see her work, Margaret felt a sense of accomplishment she had never experienced before. This wasn't happiness that depended on someone else's approval or love. This was the satisfaction of pursuing her own dreams and finding her own voice. "I'm so proud of you," Frank whispered in her ear as they stood looking at her paintings displayed on the gallery walls. "But I'm not surprised. I knew from the moment I met you that you were extraordinary." Standing there in her own art show, surrounded by people who celebrated her talent and her journey, Margaret understood that she had finally learned the most important lesson of her life, that she was worthy of love, respect, and happiness, not because someone else deemed her so, but because she was inherently valuable as a human being. She thought of her younger self, trying so desperately to earn Harold's love by making herself smaller, quieter, more convenient. She wished she could go back and tell that young woman that she was already enough, that she deserved to be cherished for exactly who she was. But perhaps this was the gift of her story, not just for herself, but for other women who might read it and recognize themselves in Margaret's journey. It was never too late to choose differently, never too late to refuse to settle for less than they deserved. As the evening wound down and she and Frank prepared to leave the gallery, Margaret took one last look at her paintings on the wall. Each canvas told part of her story, the woman she had been, the woman she was becoming, and the woman she now knew she had always been underneath the years of self-doubt and settling. Tomorrow she and Frank would wake up in the home they had chosen together, filled with both of their treasures and memories. They would have coffee on the porch and plan their day and continue building their life of mutual respect and genuine love. At 75 and 79, they were proof that the heart had no expiration date, that it was never too late for new chapters, never too late to write a better ending to your story. Margaret smiled as Frank took her arm, and they walked out into the warm evening air. Behind them, her paintings glowed under the gallery lights, bright, bold, beautiful, and unapologetically her own. Just like the woman who had created them, they were worth celebrating, worth cherishing, worth love. And Margaret Rose Patterson Morrison knew, with absolute certainty, that she was finally, completely, and joyfully home.